we sit down with Dr. Anthony Brown, a biracial African and Japanese American jazz historian and performer, and Professor Louis Watts, photographer, archivist, and co-author of Harlem of the West, San Francisco Fillmore Jazz Era, to discuss the intersection of Japanese and African Americans in music after World War II.
I'm so glad you're able to make it, be able
too.
to share your knowledge and, all of the historical background on the neighborhood that we know as the Fillmore.
Yes.
And I was just wondering if you could just perhaps talk about the migrations that led to the development of this district.
Okay. Well, the reason we are actually here right now is that when Pearl Harbor happened, as many people know, the Japanese were rounded up and put into concentration camps. And at the same time, many of the shipyards in the Bay Area and up and down the West Coast and other places converted to the war effort, and they needed people to work toward that end. And because there was not enough people to fill those spots, the word went out that there was actually employment. Many people say that World War II actually really ended the Depression. So a lot of people came from all over the country, but especially African Americans who were recruited came from Texas and Louisiana, especially to
Gulf.
the West Coast.
Yeah,
Yes.
Gulf. Yeah.
Yes, because it was close. Because I think maybe in Mississippi and Alabama they went north to, and they had been migrating before in the 20th century.
Sure.
So there were some African Americans here in the early half of the 20th century, but not very many. They were a very great minority. So so a couple things happened that when the people got here in the San Francisco, the only place where there was available housing and where actually Black people could live was in this Western addition, the Fillmore, which had been Japantown. As a concept, actually also, the neighborhood had been one of the entertainment centers of San Francisco. So there were a number of clubs that when a critical mass of African Americans appeared, changed. Some of them were taken over as management and ownings by African Americans, and the kinds of entertainment changed to jazz primarily, but also to rhythm and blues. And the West Coast became part of the expanded Chitlin circuit. So in the book, there are pictures of Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday and Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, who's on the cover, who came, and then a number of local musicians, in some cases, joined them or went on tour with them or were able to play with them. And so a burgeoning jazz scene in the Bay Area came from this sort of what happened and that sort of interaction. And at the same time that this was going on, many of the clubs hired photographers to document what was going on. The audience, who were usually dressed to the nine, and many of the musicians.
We follow Dr. Brown and Dr. Watts as they take us through a tour of former jazz venues and landmarks in the Japantown and Fillmore neighborhoods. First, we go to 1628 Post Street, where the Plantation Club existed.
I'm standing in front of the former location of the Plantation Club. It was a jazz venue that existed from 1946 to 1961. And before that, it was a Japanese restaurant that opened in 1914. And afterwards, it became a series of other restaurants. But it's another prime example of how Japantown changed after African Americans arrived during World War II. We understand that Robert Mitchum used to come and sit in with the band while it was open, and there are photographs of it in the book.
Next, we go to approximately 1650 Post Street, where before the Japanese American incarceration was the Cherryland Skiaki Club, and around the start of the war, the California Theater Club, California Supper Club.
So we're at the site of the California Theater and Supper Club. It was also a music venue, and Johnny Ingram, who was one of the major contributors to the book, performed here pretty regularly. I know that it had a sort of a good following, and they always had good clubs because he was very well known in the neighborhood.
Next, we go to the original location of Jimbo's Bop City at 1690 Post Street. Today, the California Bank and Trust.
Here we are at the original site of Jimbo's Bop City on Post in San Francisco. It was eventually, the building was actually moved down to Fillmore when redevelopment started, after the people in the neighborhood stopped the redevelopment from just tearing buildings down. It was Marcus Books for many years until it went out of business. But this is a really historic site, and also a prime example of how Japantown existed and then was redeveloped away and then has come back.
During the redevelopment era of San Francisco, the Jimbo's Bop City building was relocated to Fillmore Street, as Dr. Watts explains.
So we are actually in front of what used to be Marcus Books, and before that, this is the building that Jimbo's Bop City was in. At a certain point during redevelopment, activists in the community stopped the city from just tearing buildings down and made them move. So they moved this building from Post down here around the corner, and it became Marcus Books, which was one of the first African-American bookstores actually in the country. And it existed until probably, I'm not even sure, the 1980s, 1990s. And it was a sort of cultural center. During the Fillmore Jazz Festival, was one of the venues where you would hear music. And unfortunately, it went out of business, although it does still exist in Oakland. But I think the building is really important because it is an example of one of the buildings that existed before the Great Migration, became a cultural center, and actually moved so that the building itself still exists, even though it no longer has a connection to that past.
Next, we travel to the original site of Club Alabama, which was one of the older established clubs at the time.
So we're now at the site of the Club Alabama, which interestingly enough started in 1935. So that would have been before the Great Migration. And it closed in 1946, or at least took on a new name. I was going to say it, like the Plantation Club, sort of made reference and to appeal to the southern background of many of the people who had migrated. But in 1935, there weren't that many African Americans here, so that's sort of interesting. Earl Watkins, who was also one of the major contributors, played at this venue. As you can see, on Post Street, there were a lot of places where people could go to hear music, and that was true throughout this whole neighborhood, within 6 blocks of either direction.
Dr. Watts takes us to a venue which honors the African American roots of the Fillmore neighborhood.
So we're on Sutter Street now at the site of the Honey Art Studio. It is an art and cultural center that has existed for the last 3 or 4 years and really important in the community. It's one of the few remaining venues that reference its African American past. It was also the site of a play that was based on the events of the Fillmore during the sort of height of the migration and afterwards, and what happened during redevelopment. The proprietor is Erica Scott, and who is real important and who's someone I need to reconnect with because she has her eye on things happening in the neighborhood.
Next, we travel to the current location of the Boom Boom Room, where Dr. Watts explains its history.
So we are now at the corner of Geary and Fillmore, and in front of the Boom Boom Room. The Boom Boom Room at one point was Jack's, and it was on Fillmore but farther up. It moved here and then closed, and the Boom Boom Room's probably been open the last, say 10 years or so. And one of the few venues that actually still specializes in rhythm and blues and jazz. I've had the opportunity to talk about the Fillmore in this space, and obviously this is a really important intersection, and I'm glad that there's still some reference to both the past and the present.
Next, Dr. Watts takes us to the Fillmore Street overpass, where artist Mildred Howard's art honors the cultures and music that defines the Fillmore.
So we are actually in the overpass that on Fillmore that goes over Geary. What happened was, one of the things that happened during redevelopment is that Geary was sunk to sort of make it faster to get from the avenues to downtown. And as a result, it just almost killed many of the businesses on Fillmore, especially in this immediate area, which was also helped it to sort of disappear. This is an installation called 3 Shades of Blue that was done by Mildred Howard, incredible Bay Area, a recent Guggenheim fellow, done in 1903, and it was celebrating both the music and the culture of the area. And it was incredibly beautiful, with a poem by Quincy Troup, but it has been sort of allowed to be vandalized and nothing's been happening. And she would like the city either to take it down or to restore it, and actually neither thing has happened, which is sort of indicative of what's happened a lot of times to the heritage of this area, especially its past.
We travel to the former location of Red's Shoeshine Parlor, where Dr. Watts shares a great story.
So now we're in front of the New Chicago Barbershop. This is where I actually found the cache of photographs that led to first an exhibit in Willie Brown's office, and then as the part of the documentary that KQED did about the Fillmore, where I met my co-author Elizabeth Pepin. Reggie Pettis, the barber, noticed across the street that Red's Shine Parlor had been empty, and a lot of the clubs and photographers had given their photographs to Red after the clubs closed. And when someone sent me to Red's, and he had pictures of everybody who lived in and passed through the neighborhood. And I got really excited, and I said, Red, can I use the images? And he was having none of it. And it turned out he had been really messed around by the city and was very suspicious, probably with good cause, and had a stroke not too long after I saw him. So I went back later, and the walls were bare and he was gone. And it turned out, after I got hired to sort of gather information for a jazz preservation district, that I was asking people up and down the street what happened to the pictures in the Shoeshine Parlor, and Reggie said, oh, they're in my back room. He had noticed the landlord coming in and was starting to take the photographs down, and noticed it. And in the Black community, barbershops, mortuaries, beauty parlors are the archivists. And he knew that that was something valuable, and so was able to talk the landlord into keeping them. And they'd been sitting in his back room, and he allowed me to use them, and they became the basis for a number of exhibits and the 4 editions of Harlem of the West that eventually came out.
Next, we stand on the location of the Booker T. Washington Hotel, where some famous jazz musicians stayed.
So we are actually across the street from the site of the Booker T. Washington Hotel. There were 2 or 3 other hotels, Black-owned hotels in the neighborhood. And many of the musicians, even if they were able to play downtown, were not able to stay in the neighborhood, stay downtown. And so they would come to the Fillmore to stay. And in fact, Jimbo's Bop City became an after-hours place because many of the musicians would then want to jam when they'd finished their regular gig. There's a great picture in the book of, I think it's a breakfast, and Ella Fitzgerald is in that, and Joe the Jet Perry of the 49ers, and a number of other luminaries. And what I love about the picture is Ella has her white gloves neatly folded uh, on her purse, and across there's a really elegant dude with argyle socks. So people, it was an example of the fact that people did dress from the nines, and if you were not dressed, they would not let you in the clubs. You really did have to dress. So that's the Booker T. Washington Hotel.
Finally, we travel to the former Yoshi's Jazz Club and the current San Francisco Jazz Heritage Center.
So we're actually at the site of Yoshi's, the jazz club, which has been in Oakland for many years and made an effort to open a club here. Unfortunately, because there wasn't a lot, the sort of people weren't living here, it did not last very long, unfortunately. Next door is actually the Jazz Heritage Center, which has made an effort to, again, celebrate the heritage and history of the neighborhood. It has had a number of iterations and unfortunately is no longer available and open. Another indication of kind of sort of successes and failures in terms of the neighborhood. There's actually a really nice auditorium with great sound, and I'm hoping at some point someone will open it again. I noticed there's a sign saying Dadito, but I don't know anything about that. There's actually photographs of a number of musicians and the buildings next door. And 1300, which was a restaurant, was open for a while, but it's no longer at this location.
We close on some thoughts after the tour on how to keep the history of jazz alive in the Fillmore.
So I was wondering just what your thoughts are on kind of keeping the tradition of jazz alive today, and what you think we kind of need to do to keep that tradition going forward.
You want me to take that
Yeah,
one?
you can take that one first.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm a practitioner of jazz, but and also I'm also I have my PhD in ethnomusicology, so I studied jazz as a music and as culture. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but the importance of music in culture around the world at any time that human beings have lived on this planet, it has been central. It has brought people together. And I think that that's one of the things that we see here in the Fillmore district is that music, you know, whether I've played at Yoshi's or, you know, even played at some of the other venues here, is that the way that you keep music alive is that people have to come out to see it. So you have to play music that's going to attract people. It used to be back in the 30s, jazz was primarily a dance music. So you had dance halls, you had ballrooms. But then in the 40s and the 50s, jazz started to become more of a smaller group, or, you know, what they call a combo or a small group, and they were playing mostly in like what we know about the history of the Fillmore areas. They were playing in clubs and bars. So you had a proliferation of music that appealed to people because they would come. It would be social. People would come and gather, and those places became historic in themselves because, first of all, you have famous jazz musicians coming here. I mean, where else would they, you know, where else can you go and walk down the street and there's Ella Fitzgerald or Billie Holiday singing or Charlie Parker or Louis Armstrong? I mean, all the greats played here. So there must have been something that was able to attract them. So was it the clubs, the audience? You need both of those. You need the venues, you need the audience, and you need to, first of all, offer a music that people are going to enjoy. So I think that's the key to the success of music here in this Bay Area, in this area of the Bay Area. But wherever you see enclaves, like people talk about New York and they talk about Chicago, well, you know, we have that same thing right here in the Bay Area, right here in the Fillmore.
And I also think it's actually important, especially for young people, that they become exposed to it. I think that may be one of the things, the fact that it's not popular music anymore. It's sort of akin to classical music, and I think it's important that it's covered in schools, that parents and adults expose their children to you know, a variety of different art forms, but especially of things like jazz and rhythm and blues. because that's really how, that's how new musicians happen, and practitioners, but also how an audience continues. And I think that's, everybody has been saying jazz is dead for years, and it seems to keep enduring. So I think that's the case, but I think it is important that people, and especially people who love jazz, make sure that it gets out it stays and gets out into the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're looking at these great books, but then there's a book here called Reminiscing in Swing Time by George Yoshida. And to me, this exemplifies the fact that you can participate in jazz coming from wherever background you coming from. George Yoshida being Japanese American, yet what he talks about in this book is that when Japanese Americans were put in those concentration camps, they played this music that kept that they enjoyed, that kept them inspired before the incarceration, and then they brought it with them. That to me shows the importance of music.
And I know, I can't think of his name, but there's a number of people who came back back to Japantown, and who, as 13 and 14-year-olds, would sort of sit outside of Jimbo's and other clubs and listen to the music. That was one of their great memories of growing up. So that idea of culture sort of spreading and being something that was pervasive, all pervasive, was actually really important.